3 years ago, Total War Warhammer 3 came out, and it was so broken and just bad at launch that it inspired me to go back to Total War Warhammer 2. I ended up beating all of the campaigns on very hard, for the achievements, and then I went back to Warhammer 1, and I got all the achievements there. And now here we are, on my very last campaign of Total War Warhammer 3, the most recent DLC, the Chaos Wars. This is my footage from after I tried to play the final battle of the regular campaign, only to have it break on me about a dozen times. I ultimately decided to go for a domination campaign victory, which took maybe 2 hours. But given how long it took to complete the other 2 games, I'd say 2 hours was well worth it. This is going to be a little bit of a different video from what I normally make. It's pretty much just the last hour of my campaign, and I'm just going to talk over it and discuss a little bit about the Total War Warhammer series. It's also my first unscripted video, so you'll have to bear with me and my awkward everything. I'll start by talking about the Chaos Dwarves as a faction. I actually really enjoyed the campaign for this one up until the point it broke. There was a pretty obvious telegraphing right from the beginning that if you just pump influence, you can eventually confederate the other 3 Chaos Dwarf factions, so I ended up playing this one pretty defensively, just sticking to 1 or 2 regions and helping the allied factions out wherever I could until I was able to confederate them. And I really liked the roster. The sort of combination of line gunmen and heavy artillery pieces reminded me of playing through Total War Napoleon. Although as far as I know, the French armies never fielded giant winged bulls. I wouldn't say it was one of my favorite factions, but I did enjoy it overall. There's actually a few pretty common questions I've been getting from people who've noticed that I've, done this. The first one is, how long did it take? And I don't want to talk about it. If you've been watching the gameplay footage, you'll probably notice that I am pretty checked out of the actual game at this point. After so many hours in the game, you really start to hate these sort of minor settlement sieges, and pretty much anything that can be auto-resolved and doesn't seem like it would be a very interesting fight gets auto-resolved. I was pretty much only playing battles where there wasn't a clear-cut chance of winning. And even then, I would sometimes just auto-resolve them and take the loss. Once you get to the very end stages of a campaign in Total War Warhammer 3, pretty much all of the fun is sucked out of the game. You've got infinite resources, so you can just consistently spawn new armies. There's really no stakes to anything you do. Every decision can be easily fixed by just raising another army and recruiting another Doomstack. So after a few hundred hours, it really becomes a game of auto-resolving. This obviously isn't the way I started playing the Total War Warhammer games. I remember when I got the first game back in 2016, I think? Yeah. My computer wasn't top of the line at the time, and I had maybe 15-minute loads between every single battle. But I did fight every single battle. And in the load times, I read 100 Years of Solitude. The reality of achievement hunting, especially for a series like this, is that eventually you do get kind of bored of the game. In my case, it was after I had completed Warhammer 2 and 1, and then had to come back to Warhammer 3, because they finally put Immortal Empires in, and with it came, 20-ish new achievements to complete every race's campaign on very hard. I fell for what's called the sunk cost fallacy. But that's okay. They say the difference between medicine and poison is the dosage, and in this case I pretty well overdosed on Total War Warhammer. The other question I get asked a lot is what my favorite factions are. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the Lizardmen. I really like their roster of tough, fast-ish units, combined with the relatively slow Saurians that just sort of roll in like a wave to mop things up. They're a really good faction for just kind of blobbing up and sending at an enemy and, doing some little skirmishes around the edges. After the Lizardmen, it's probably Dwarves, Undead, Skaven, and I hate to say it, but I do actually really like the Wood Elves. Feels dirty to say. All of the factions have had really interesting mechanics added as the series has progressed. Most of this we saw in Total War 2, specifically the DLCs like Grom the Paunch, where they started adding adjustable bonuses to units that you could unlock through campaign side quests. And I really liked the factors that limit unit capacity, like the Tomb Kings having their capacity tied to how many buildings of a certain type they have, or with the new Beastmen, or even the Chaos Dwarves having secondary systems that kind of control how many top-tier units they can maintain at one time. It felt like a very good change over the kind of beginning of Warhammer 3, where you ultimately end up snowballing into a army of tier 5 units that just kind of wipe the floor with everything. I'm going to take a bold stance here and say that I think Total War Warhammer 2 is the best of the series. It's kind of hard to evaluate because I've been playing these games since they came out, and for the most part, every version of the game that I've played no longer exists. They've been patched so many times, and I've played so many campaigns with different issues. Some of them have been fixed, some of them haven't, but there's been a lot of rebalancing for all of the games in the series. But overall, I have the fondest memories of the second game. And as it exists now, it is the most complete final product of a game. The first in the series didn't have quite enough variety at the campaign level to make every single race seem interesting, and the third suffers from some pretty unique problems of its own, which I'll get into in a moment. But the second game really has the perfect level of complexity and adjustability of difficulty to make it my favorite of the series. It also helps that I don't particularly care for any of the new factions they've added in Warhammer 3. But let's get into it a little more. I've got a handful of issues with the third game. The first one is the rosters themselves. Kislev and Cathay both have a strong focus on hybrid infantry, and ultimately it makes their units feel like they lack a distinct purpose, like the armies are kind of identical. I had the same issue with the High Elves and the Dark Elves in Warhammer 2. On higher difficulties, missile units really outpace infantry, so you end up with a lot of very similar armies, just blobs of units shooting and then not moving for melee. And likewise, I thought that the 4 new Chaos factions also lacked a certain difference in play style. They all heavily favor melee, and it's just kind of a matter of how fast their units are. There's also a major issue with power creep in the third game. This has been a problem since the first game came out, where every DLC faction tends to be just a little bit stronger than the baseline factions for the game. But at this point, those little nudges of power creep have been happening for so very long that when a new faction encounters an older faction, it pretty much walks all over it with no chance of the older faction really succeeding. In the campaigns, this can either be tedious or frustrating depending on which side of the power balance you're on. I also really dislike their decision to change the maximum level for Lords to 50. There's 2 real issues I have with this. One is that by level 50 your Lord can have basically every useful ability on his skill tree, so instead of making important decisions as you level them up, it becomes a lot easier to simply use the auto management feature that just levels the Lord up for you. Usually you'll get the feats you wanted anyways, and it's a lot less micromanagement. But on the other hand, it's also an important choice that is being removed from the player's hands. The other problem is how a level 50 Lord actually affects the real-time combat of the game. When you run into a combat-focused legendary Lord that's max level, the entire battle shifts to just killing that Lord. It's extremely common to run into a fight with a Von Karstein or one of the Orc Lords that just devolves into kiting him around while your ranged units waste all of their ammo trying to take him down. Sometimes these could last 20 minutes. And for the most part, it doesn't matter what troops they bring. Once a legendary lord is on the field, there's such an incredible threat compared to the regular units. A lot of times they can solo an entire army, so the game really stops being about the actual army and more about a hero duel. It's not tactically interesting, and most of the time I ended up in these fights, it felt pretty cheesy. Personally, I prefer it when a game allows me to play in a somewhat realistic way and not have to cheese a bunch to, get those wins. Some of the most fun in this game actually comes from the very early game, when you can't field a full 20-unit army, and your opponent also probably isn't fielding a full 20-unit army. Those moments where you have a non-optimal army that you have to kind of tactically assemble in just the right way, that's what really elevates the game, and it's a lot more interesting gameplay than late game where you just smash tier 5 units against each other blindly and generally end up winning. A lot of factions also lose something with the 20-unit cap. For the Skaven specifically, it seems like they should pretty much always have a full stack of Skaven slaves or something to bog down the enemy. But since you have that 20-unit cap to bear in mind, when you're assembling your army, you'll always opt for the more high-tier units instead. Especially late game when you'll have no economic concerns preventing you from doing just that. And I guess that is the biggest problem with this series, is every battle starts to feel the same after a certain point. Once you have a grasp of ideal army composition for your faction, you'll probably tend to just build that army every single time. There's no point to changing it if it keeps winning over and over. And there's not enough mechanics in place to prevent you from spamming the higher grade units. And you'll probably have to, because most of the time your enemy will be bringing stacks of monsters into each fight. Some of the reworked factions do have unit caps on high tier units, and I think it is generally a good way for the series to go. But without it being uniformly applied to the other factions, they tend to suffer in engagements where the enemy can just spam their heaviest troops. And the terrain on the battle maps rarely presents enough tactical options to make it interesting. I really think what the series could use is more restrictions on how you start battles, maybe taking a page from turn-based RPGs where sometimes your forces will arrive split up, or the enemy will appear a little closer to you than you might expect. Maybe have the speed rankings of individual units affect their entry into the battlefield. Or just have the AI build more interesting armies. Maybe the biggest issue with the late game is that it doesn't put you in interesting situations often enough. And in fact, most of the AI tends towards annoying strategies, like baiting your army with their own army, and making you waste several turns as you try to catch up. The AI also rarely initiates siege battles, so you'll end up being on the offensive for most of the siege battles you play, and it is simply not as fun of a position to be in. There have been some improvements on this with their later patches, but it still seems to be a general rule. Your enemy won't siege a city unless they have 2 or 3 armies that they can bring into the battle. These probably aren't issues that you would notice if you were only playing a few campaigns, but in the course of 100%ing the series, I've probably played 100 campaigns. I don't really know why I started achievement hunting. Maybe 3 years ago is really when I got started with it. Before then I would just play games and finish them and consider them done. But I've always liked to have a real-time strategy game or an MMO or something that I sort of keep as a baseline while I try other games. And since I started making these reviews, well, it's gotten a lot more necessary. At times, this does sort of feel like work, so it is important for me to keep playing games that I don't really have an intention of reviewing. And achievement hunting gives me a good reason to revisit games without that expectation that I'll make a review or be somehow productive with my time. Besides that, achievements often let me play games in a way I wouldn't normally. Before I started achievement hunting, I mostly played on hard campaign and hard battle difficulty. That changed once I started this. I had to beat several campaigns on legendary, and then I had to play every faction on very hard in order to unlock some additional achievements. It made me a lot better at the game, but at the same time, it was kind of exhausting to play every single faction several times in the course of completing all 3 games. As you might have guessed, the most annoying achievements to get are the Immortal Empires achievements for Total War Warhammer 3. Mostly, this is because you can only play the factions on the Immortal Empires game mode, which takes a lot longer than a normal campaign. I sped it up a little using the endgame scenarios that pop out a crisis army somewhere on the map for you to kill, because defeating those armies actually counts as a victory. So what I would do is start a new campaign and set the crisis to trigger somewhere around turn 100, then kind of gear my playstyle to creating a few strong armies that I could use to go take down whichever crisis popped out. It did seem that the Chaos Dwarves crisis is the easiest to use when farming these achievements, mostly due to the portals that open up all over the map. They let you teleport right to the faction stronghold, and beside that, the local orcs would generally have taken out most of the Chaos Dwarfs by the time I got there. The other good tip, which I realized when playing my least favorite faction, Bretonnia, is that combat difficulty can be set to whatever. As long as the campaign difficulty is very hard, it counts for the purposes of the achievement. Although I would still recommend playing at a combat difficulty that is appropriate for your skill level with the faction, because otherwise it will get very, very boring. Putting the combat difficulty on easy will make auto-resolves pretty inevitable. It seems to me that achievements aren't necessarily a test of skill, but a test of how much free time you have, and that's really apparent in this series. Every campaign takes, 7 hours or so? And you're looking at a minimum of 24 campaigns just to get the achievements for Warhammer 3. So it's just a trial of how little you have going on. And luckily enough, I have very little going on. While there wasn't anything too difficult, there were some exceptionally tedious achievements. For the most part, they were the achievements to research everything for every faction, and the first game had these raiding income achievements where you, as the orcs, had to reach a certain income through raiding alone. Those were pretty frustrating to get. You just had to gear every army towards maximizing raiding income. I think I did it in the downtime after finishing a campaign, so it was just a lot of extra legwork that didn't really add anything to the experience. I was hoping to feel some sense of accomplishment or something after completing this, but to be honest, I mostly just feel relief that it's done. I don't really know why I got it stuck in my head that I had to do this, but I did, and, well, I don't have to do it again. So that's something. Anyways, that's it for this video. My big takeaway is that I'm actually very bad at ad-libbing. This whole video took me about 2 months. So in the future, I will return to scripting my videos beforehand. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, see you!